Los ojos del mundo están puestos sobre la Franja de Gaza mientras la justicia internacional se enfrenta de nuevo a denuncias sobre crímenes de lesa humanidad, crímenes de guerra y genocidio. Europa, por su parte, enfrenta en su suelo el mayor enfrentamiento bélico desde la Segunda Guerra Mundial, mientras países como Yemen, Siria o Sudán viven guerras que han pasado a un segundo plano en la agenda internacional en medio de este convulso panorama. Pero no solo las guerras, sino también el hambre, la falta de oportunidades siguen expulsando a millones de personas alrededor del mundo, lo que ha atizado la xenofobia y la instrumentalización política de la migración en los países receptores. Todo esto ha alimentado un mundo ya polarizado y por eso es tan pertinente escuchar voces como la del profesor Coleman de la Universidad de Columbia, experto en resolución de conflictos y quien está de visita en Colombia y amablemente nos acompaña hoy en Entrevistas El Espectador. Professor, welcome to Entrevistas El Espectador. Thank you for being with us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
I would say to start that one might agree that some kind of conflict is often necessary for innovation to occur.
Yeah.
So at what point can we say that we are facing a toxic polarization and not just a normal, creative, or even revolutionary dissent?
Yeah, great question. So I am a believer that conflict is a good force, can be a good force in our own decision making, in our relationships, in our families and communities. And in politics in particular, it's good to have sort of passionate, true believers, intelligent people from different points of view that clash and that challenge each other. I think it's a really important component to democracies and figuring out a better way forward. But sometimes those differences become much more entrenched, more extreme, farther apart, and then they lead to certain kinds of dislike and contempt for one another, and love for your own group, but disdain for the other group. So when it moves into that and it becomes protracted and goes on, that's when it really starts to become toxic. It becomes toxic for the public because we're getting a lot of hate and vitriol in the news or through cultural, celebrities and others. Or it becomes toxic in our own life because we have divisions suddenly within our family. We start to feel estranged from people that we used to be able to talk to. So that's really when it moves into a different kind of dynamic that's not useful or not as useful as it was, and it can take on a life of its own. When you really say, all right, I don't want to talk to you anymore, then the chances are of it becoming worse and worse increase.
And from what you've studied, what would you say are the main factors or situations that trigger this toxic polarization within our societies nowadays?
So every society is different, right? There are different factors that are common, certainly social media algorithms that sort us so that they feed you more of what you're interested in or your opinions. And so you start to move away from others and move away even in the mainstream media and presentation of the news. There's certain media you watch, certain media you refuse to watch. So it can happen in different ways. There are general categories of things like a polarized media that weaponize information, like political leaders that capitalize on polarization as a way to hold on to power or gain power. But also, oftentimes, it feeds on frustrations with the public, right? They feel the economy is bad, they can't get jobs, they can't make ends meet, or they feel looked down upon and disrespected by the elite. So when that combination of things happens, it can become more and more toxic. Again, every society is different. Even within Columbia, I'm sure you have different regions where different issues become pain points. So it's hard to essentialize. But when these things start to feed each other, when the news and where you travel and don't travel and your own attitudes and your family and people you do talk to and you don't talk to, when those things start to align, it becomes easier to become estranged from the other side and to just disengage until it's too late.
Now that you mentioned the Colombian case, I would like to know what have you seen from this case where the debates around the peace processes have been a major ground for division and polarization, even to this day.
Yeah. Well, so I tend, because I study peace processes, I tend to take a long-term view of peace processes. And it is true that oftentimes when peace agreements are reached, there are spoilers. There are people that feel left out or frustrated or aggrieved by the conditions of the agreement. And that can lead to a period of division and resentment. This happened in Northern Ireland as well. But eventually you can start to put things back together so that there is agreement on key things, key aspects of the original peace agreement. So it's unfortunate when something like a peace treaty or a peace agreement divides a population. It's not altogether surprising because there were different camps and different groups, and it's a big political event that is then weaponized by different actors. But it doesn't mean that it has to get worse. There is an opportunity, there is a time. If enough of the public are sort of fed up with this sort of back and forth and with a less constructive approach to the future of the country, that's a good time to find another way, find an alternative way that is not one extreme or the other, but is more moderate, or not moderate, but really respectful of the needs and interests of people on both sides of the issues.
Related to this, you've worked on the concept of sustainable peace.
Yeah.
And so what is sustainable peace, and are there any examples for you that are worth mentioning?
Yeah, so sustainably peaceful societies in our research are societies that for 50 years, 100 years, sometimes 300 years have oftentimes intentionally chosen to live in peace. So Costa Rica is one example, the Scandinavian countries, New Zealand, Mauritius in Africa, Botswana. There are countries all over the world, there are societies all over the world that really choose not to fight or go into use war or to reduce violence as much as possible internally in their societies and with other societies and nations. And Costa Rica is a good example. In 1948, it came out of a bloody civil war, and it took that as an opportunity when people were fed up with violence and war to say, let's choose a different path, let's invest in education as a place to promote tolerance and acceptance and peace process, conflict resolution, constructive conflict resolution, and to grow a new society. So they recognize that it would take time, and you want to start with younger people if you can, because they're the future. But you really need to socialize them into a different way of problem solving that turns away from violence and turns into kind of, more constructive dynamics between people with differences.
Mm-hmm. And I suppose this has to be like a daily choice, like not to get peace for granted.
It's hard work. I mean, I've studied Mauritius, the country in Africa. It's the most peaceful nation in the continent of Africa. And they've really only come out, they're only about 50 years into a peace process, but they're very intentional about how they think about peace. The editors of the major newspapers and media outlets are very intentional about how they cover events, right? It's not that they don't cover events, but they're careful about not oversimplifying and dividing people or putting the most contentious people together just to get attention. They really want to provide context to their viewers. So it's hard work. Mauritius is a country that has many different religious groups that come together, but they respect the fact that there are these differences, and they respect each other's rituals and events and celebrations, and they involve them, they invite them. So there is work to sustaining peace. It's not something that just happens, but like toxic polarization, sustainably peaceful dynamics can tip into a dynamic where they become the norm. And when societies reach that, it's very unlikely that they tip back into violence. It's very rare for sustainably peaceful societies to backslide into violence within the nation or in their foreign affairs.
Mm-hmm. Professor, the world is witnessing two major wars with major geopolitical implications.
Yeah.
And I would like to ask you, what can we learn, the world learn from our incapability of reaching agreements at all levels, not only the battlefield or the peace talks, but also the social media, the public opinion, the United Nations. So what is this incapability telling us?
Well, when wars like these break out, it shows the vulnerabilities of democracies and the vulnerabilities of our systems of peace, including the UN. The UN is a flawed agency. It's a beautiful idea, but it in many ways is flawed and problematic. But there are good, smart people looking hard at why what the UN does, for example, doesn't help enough, right? What are the alternative types of institutions that we need? Sometimes people look at the UN and think we put too much on it. We expect too much of the UN. And we need to sort of decentralize that kind of work, peace-building work. So I think what we have to learn from this is why we got into this in the first place in both of these situations, right? In Israel and Gaza, or Israel and Palestine more generally, and in Ukraine. We have to look at the conditions that led to this. It's not always controllable, but the fact that they are now grinding on for so long really speaks to the fact that we're lacking in our peacekeeping and our peacemaking processes that really take these situations seriously and can move in and de-escalate them quickly. And so we have to pay serious attention to why that is and what needs to change.
Mm-hmm. Related to the war in Gaza, you recently published a text on how to leverage the current crisis in Columbia University. So I would like to ask you, you talk about the concept of resetting. Yeah. So I would like to ask you if this, not only what's happening in Columbia, but the student movement as a whole across the US and other countries, if this is an opportunity to reset important things such as institutions, social agreements, policies. And I'm asking you this, having in mind the comparisons we've heard between what's happening today and what happened back in the 60s with the social movements.
Yeah, again, there are some similarities, but very different types of events. So I'm impressed that you know my most recent publications, but the fact that Columbia in particular was the sort of epicenter of this crisis. It had happened, there had been protests elsewhere, but it wasn't, it got very problematic very fast at Columbia. There are a variety of reasons for that. Columbia is in New York City. It's a large media, center. It has the largest Jewish population outside of Israel in the world. So there are reasons why oftentimes outside activists and agitators take advantage of things like what's happening in the Middle East and start to weaponize them and leverage them to bring attention to a cause on a campus. But like everything I'll talk about, it's complicated. It's also where the students were, that many students felt isolated and insulated in a kind of state of meaninglessness, and this brought purpose and moral clarity to their experience of their life on campus. I understand that. I think that was a similar parallel in 1968, but and we had new leadership, we had outside activists that were coming in. We had a faculty that was very vocal and encouraging of the protests. So, and there's also just sort of denial of the anti-Semitism and the impact of the protests on Jewish colleagues and Jewish students. So again, these are hard events, but they are opportunities for leaders, leaders at all levels, to really think about, okay, this was hard, this got out of control, this didn't have to go this way. What was it about our culture, about our basic assumptions, and about how we see each other and how we think about free speech versus protecting the rights of citizens, How do we think about those things in relationship to each other? So it's an opportunity to reset. And that is what we find with these societies like Costa Rica, where they come out of horrible events and say, okay, we really have to sort of challenge our basic assumptions, where we put our money, what we hope for in our future. And so this is an opportunity on campuses across the West, where you saw protests around Israel-Gaza spike. It's an opportunity for all of them to reflect on their basic assumptions and principles and what went wrong, but also what went right that they could build on and promote.
And related to this also, several times people, communities, organizations are aware of the polarization and the harm that it causes. But sometimes the governments and the decision makers not only don't care or need to feed or nourish this polarization for the sake of their political purposes. So how can civil societies overcome the lack of political commitment of their leaders?
I think we have to hold our leaders to account. I think you're right that the incentive system that is up, certainly I have to speak about America. In America, the more provocative you can be as a political candidate, the more attention you'll get, the more money you'll raise. So it's really built into the incentive structure of the system. And that's a huge pathology in our system. So we have to figure out how to change those incentives so that there are many good people that go into politics for good reasons because they're trying to do good things in communities. But it's so hard to survive if the incentive structure is really pulling you in a different direction. And that's, I think, really one of the big pathologies we've seen in the U.S., and we have to take it seriously and dismantle it. The good news is, again, there are politicians like Derek Kilmer, who's a chairman of the Select Committee for the Modernization of Congress. He's a congressman from Washington. He's worked with his Republican colleagues for years to really look critically at the incentive system in Congress. Why is Congress such an epicenter of division and hate when it should be about problem solving? How do we get back there? So these are places and people that are able to do that, and that exists in every sector. One of the things you may be interested in is in the U.S. there's been a movement for the past 10 years to look critically at journalism and how the business model of journalism and how journalists, reporters do their work may be contributing to oversimplifying things, to seeing only two sides in a context where there may be 12 sides to emphasize. So how do you complicate narratives, still make them compelling so that people will be interested, but not oversimplify and not vilify or allow people to vilify in the news, not allow your mechanism to be weaponized. And so there are movements within journalism really to push back on that, and I think there's a lot of hope in those.
And do you think these people in the media or in journalism or at Congress, these people are being heard regarding the current political campaign in the United States, or does it worry you?
The current political campaign worries me every minute. I'm very concerned and anxious about what's happening in our country. It's very unpredictable. We're really, the differences between the parties and the candidates are, razor thin. So I'm very concerned about it. But I'm also concerned because of social media and disinformation campaigns that are so effective and so prominent, and our lack of capacity to rein those in. And so, I think the media is sort of doing the best it can. The media, as you know, is also in disarray as an industry. And so they're struggling to figure out what are tenable economic models for their industry. And one of them is to keep the attention on provocative things. That sometimes is necessary, but often backfires in terms of the impact it has on the population and in terms of polarizing it. So I'm not pessimistic, but I'm worried. I'm very worried about our country, and I think there are some that say, well, we've seen things like this before. No, we've never seen this constellation of factors coming, feeding each other at the same time in our history before. This is a unique time. We have to take it very seriously.
Okay, well, Professor, we're running out of time, but I would like to thank you very much for your insights and your time, and I hope to see you soon again in Colombia.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Y a ustedes, nuestra audiencia, muchas gracias por conectarse con una nueva entrega de Entrevistas al Espectador. Hasta la próxima oportunidad.